I'd like to start with sleep, and I might go on a bit of a preamble, Darren, if that's okay, just because this is a subject that's interested me for some time. I came across a study a few years ago that was published by Radhika Bashir and Marcus Dvorak that was looking at the effects of creatine supplementation on the sleep of rats. And obviously, these aren't humans, but it's fascinating and it demonstrates a few things that I think are relevant. The background to it is that sleep is homeostatically regulated, by which I mean that our bodies actively defend the amount of sleep that they get, the same way that they defend things like their blood pressure, the amount of sugar in the blood, and so on. In some ways, your sleepiness and drive for sleep is a little bit like your drive for hunger. By that, I mean that your hunger generally increases with additional time without food, but there are peaks and troughs in that hunger too, depending on things like the drive for wakefulness that is a product of your body's clock. And your brain craves a particular form of sleep, which is so-called slow wave sleep or deep sleep. And when we look at the actual physiological correlates of this slow wave sleep or slow wave activity, then the most important ones are adenosine and ATP in the small spaces between cells in the brain. So we can think of adenosine and ATP in these spaces as being a little bit like chemical stopwatches that track how long you've been awake. And what the adenosine and the ATP do is agonize receptors on glial cells. And in turn, these glial cells produce some sleep-promoting cytokines, such as interleukin-1 and TNF-alpha. And they then lead to the shuffling around of some receptors on brain cells that makes those cells less likely to fire. And then when that happens in a sufficient number of adjacent neurons, they start showing sleep-like activity. And so in this way, sleep can actually be thought of as being a somewhat local phenomenon. And you do experience micro sleeps during the day. And this is actually one of the things that contributes to deterioration in performance during cognitively demanding tasks when they're done for long periods. And obviously, when there's enough of that sleep-like activity in large columns of neurons, you start seeing more global sleep and you see what most of us would recognize as being sleep. And so with all of that said, supplementing creatine monohydrate could potentially increase the total amount of these high energy phosphates in the brain. And that in turn could buffer the accumulation of adenosine and ATP. And that would be expected to reduce that hunger for sleep and therefore reduce the total amount of sleep that somebody might get and the amount of time spent in deep sleep. So against that backdrop, Dvorak and Bashir did some work where they added creatine monohydrate to the rat's chow for 4 weeks, and they looked at the rat's sleep. And they found that, sure enough, they slept less, and it was substantially less. It was about 32% less. And they had less deep sleep specifically. And then related to that, they had less rebound sleep after sleep deprivation. So normally if you deprive an animal of sleep, then their sleep will increase the following night, particularly the amount of deep sleep, given the fact that their bodies are trying to defend that deep sleep specifically. So all of this is pointing to the fact that they have lower homeostatic sleep drive. We still don't know if creatine supplementation substantially affects human sleep. And I think there are plenty of reasons to think that the effects would be substantially smaller than they would be in rodents like rats. But creatine can be helpful in the context of insufficient sleep. And I thought that we might start there when thinking about the effects of creatine on cognition.
Well, that's an elegant analogy, and I never thought of it that way, but it does make sense. So the way I've looked at it previously is that the biggest mechanism in the brain is that creatine really decreases oxidative stress. And so what's been shown is during sleep deprivation, you're going to have a lot of reactive oxidative species and oxidative stress and inflammation. And creatine really seems to improve mitochondrial function. And that seemed to be the logical reason why some individuals feel better equipped with sleep deprivation, because it sort of resembles jet lag or whichever it is. But the answer is we're not sure. We don't really know. But your explanation or theory is probably just as concurrent as all the others. I was leaning more to the oxidative stress, but it does make sense. If you can maintain the cellular bioenergetics of the brain, that would help alleviate the need for rest and or the need for sleep. So that was sort of the way I kind of looked at it. But your idea is very similar in analogy. You're just trying to maintain homeostasis. And unfortunately, we only have a few evidence-based studies in sleep. They're not that greatly designed to actually measure can creatine offset the effects of sleep deprivation. But the other one is, if it does that correlate to improvements in activities of daily living? So, for example, creatine may somehow improve some experimental studies or tasks of sleep deprivation, but does that individual need 4 or 5 coffees a day just to get through the day? Those are the areas that we need from a practical application standpoint.
Can you tell us a bit about why it might be relatively harder to actually boost brain creatine as opposed to levels of creatine in skeletal muscles? Because I think that's particularly important and relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, and this is the big one. So our muscles do not produce or synthesize creatine, so they act as sort of a vacuum. They will suck up everything that they can from the bloodstream. Our brain is very picky. Yeah, everybody's familiar with the blood-brain barrier, and those endothelial cells at the blood-brain barrier say, "Hey, we're very sort of picky to what gets in." Now, creatine can trickle into the brain. Some of the enzymes that are needed are sort of transporters through cells called oligodendrocytes, but the big one, astrocytes, don't have these transporters. So unfortunately, creatine can only get into the brain in certain areas. So they're immediately, compared to muscle, it's blunted. And the other thing is, brain says, well, wait a minute, I already make my own creatine, unlike muscle. Why do I need what's coming from the blood? So it can't. The machinery for making creatine, very similar in the liver. The enzymes are in astrocytes and oligodendrocytes and other glial cells as well. So the brain has two things going for it. It has a blood-brain barrier. It's very resistant to what gets in, and it says, hey, I already make enough. Now, the idea is creatine can accumulate. There's probably about 13 studies now that have used the magnet showing that creatine does accumulate, either total creatine or phosphocreatine, in certain areas of the brain. It takes a lot longer. It might require longer dosing or higher amounts because it has to overcome those two barriers, but it can get in. And that's a big difference between brain and muscle research. Typically, creatine will increase muscle by about 20 to 40%. We're only seeing on average about 10 to 20% increase in the brain. So there is a big difference between the two tissue compartments.
In the case of the brain, creatine transport into the brain is affected by nutrition substantially too. So the creatine transporter, CT1, that shuttles creatine into the brain is downregulated through supplementation as well.
Yeah, so this was a theory. If we go all the way back, people thought, well, if I take creatine, will it downregulate my natural production? And we didn't see any of the evidence at the mRNA level for muscle, but there's high compensatory evidence in the brain that if you're taking in creatine from the brain will say, hey, why do I need to work and make more? I'm just going to use what's taken in from the periphery. So that was one of the things we sort of postulated in our review last year, heads up, is that if creatine natural synthesis in the brain could be downregulated with supplementation. So it might be just a wash or a balance. And that's one of the areas that we speculate. Ironically, though, there's some evidence to suggest that your habitual dietary intake pattern, vegan or vegetarian versus omnivore, do not influence the amount in the brain, but it does influence the amount in the muscle. So there is a big disconnect between the two areas.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that heads up paper. One of the things that you discussed in that paper was one of the fundamental issues with imaging studies that quantify metabolites relative to brain creatine. I wonder if you could briefly touch on that.
Yeah, so there's only a few labs that have the magnet, Brazil, and then a good colleague of mine in Norway. And of course, if you have the P or hydrogen ion, you can look at total creatine or phosphocreatine. But we made the cases, what if it's in the gray matter, white matter, different areas of the brain? What are the contexts of that and how much does it accumulate? So the nuances of measuring this is really elaborate, super expensive. And that's why there's not a lot of evidence-based research out there on that now. So hopefully over time we'll accumulate more, but there's a lot of nuances with it for sure.
And obviously very low levels of brain creatine signaling can result in dramatically worse brain function. We see that in rare congenital instances of errors in creatine metabolism, and they result in intellectual disability, autism, and other issues too. But thinking about healthy people, it's clear that brain creatine can be compromised too. And when it is compromised, creatine supplementation might then come into its own. And two examples of that are during sleep restriction, so the loss of sleep, but allowing some sleep, sleep deprivation, and also hypoxia. So I wonder if you could touch on some of these studies and what they've shown.
Yeah, a common denominator, what you just alluded to, is we're not seeing really any good evidence that if the person is healthy, adequate sleep, performing activities, daily living, we don't see any noticeable beneficial effects from creatine. There's a few studies, but then there's probably more now showing that you don't. But during times of metabolic stress, or when the brain is stressed, as you mentioned, hypoxia, altitude, sleep deprivation, aging, there's been now a few studies that creatine has been able to sort of compensate for the reduction in natural brain creatine content or a reduction in brain bioenergetics. The best lines of evidence come from those children born with inborn creatine deficiencies where they can't make creatine. By giving them supplementation, they have healthy lives compared to those who don't. The few studies now have looked at concussion in children. Those individuals with compromised creatine metabolism, creatine that has some favorable effects there. And of course, the populations with clinically diagnosed depression, creatine seems to have some beneficial effects when those individuals still take medication. So there's some potential. But other areas such as neurophysiological diseases, we're not seeing great promise. Primarily, the speculation is because we need large sample sizes. But you would speculate Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, they would probably have a reduction in brain creatine stores, but we're not really seeing a lot of great promise there. So in summary, creatine may work if the brain is compromised. From a healthy individual, I think a student studying, cramming all overnight, flying to Europe, if I have to go, you're jet lagged for a few days. People say, what's a symptom? You feel very foggy. Your sleep patterns are all off. Whenever I do that, I increase my creatine dose above what I'm already taking. And it does it have an effect? I'm an N of 1, but I seem to rely on it. So I take about 10 grams a day now for the whole body perspectives, whereas some people may just take 3 grams a day for muscle. But I'm sort of looking at it from a whole body perspective.
This is slightly tangential, but there's been some research recently looking at the effects of ketogenic diet on cognition during insufficient sleep or sleep deprivation, suggesting that the ketogenic diet might help preserve some dimensions of cognition at that time. And one thing I wonder about is whether those studies are confounded by differences in creatine intake, because I think a lot of people, when they go on ketogenic diets, they consume more dietary protein and more creatine. And it might not be the ketones per se that are supporting their brain function at that time, but other things such as an increase in creatine, such as more stable blood sugar levels than they.
It's easily one of the first things I bring up when I'm reviewing papers on two things: the ketogenic diet and the animal versus plant-based protein diet. Because sometimes when you're looking at a paper and the animal-based diet is superior, the first thing I ask is, did you control for the amount of creatine across the board? And no one ever does. So if it's in red meat and seafood, that could be one of the contributing factors. You could also argue maybe it's omega-3 or whichever, but the same thing goes for a ketogenic diet. You could also argue, would an or a carnivore diet be superior to a plant-based diet? My speculation is, well, if protein was matched and they were superior, it may have to do with another ingredient, and you'd have to at least consider the amount of creatine in red meat, seafood, and poultry. Absolutely.
In the case of the ketogenic diet, a lot of people find it really hard to stick to. If you look, for instance, at the Verta Health studies, where people get lots of support and they do experience dramatic improvements in various markers of their cardiometabolic health over time. But when you look at what they're consuming by the end of a several month or several year long intervention, the diet is probably no longer ketogenic. It's just low in carbohydrate. And so in some of these instances, chalking up the effects to ketones is not something that we can really do. And I mention this in part because I know that you've done some work looking at medium chain triglyceride supplementation, its potential effects on the brain. And one of the things that I'm really curious about, that we might come back to, but we might not, is looking at some of these different things in combination with each other. Because when you think about a brain that is loaded with creatine, and also is swimming in ketones. And you could also have it so that
Mhm.
brain glycogen stores were full at the same time. That's a very unusual energetic state for the brain. It might turn some people manic. I don't know. But for other people,
Yeah.
it might be a really interesting way to protect themselves against some of the detrimental effects of things like sleep deprivation.
Yeah, I think it's all potential there. I think that sleep deprivation is probably one of the, at least in the top 5 concerns for everybody. I don't really know anybody that's not sleep deprived nowadays. Even retirees seem they're so busy, and um, you know, when you feel like you got a good night's sleep, you feel amazing. Everything is just better. But more times than not, most people are always sleep deprived, or they're thinking about what they got to do. And if we can come up with a lifestyle intervention that's safe and effective, I think the population from a global perspective is going to be all over it.
You traced over some of the studies, but I just thought it might be worth pausing and reflecting on some of the work that's looked at different types of brain dysfunction. And if we think about these in terms of the types that are arguably most relevant to the listeners, then among these are mood disorders. And there have been several studies looking at creatine supplementation, sometimes in isolation, but sometimes in conjunction with medications for people with depression and anxiety. So I wonder if you could just go into those in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, there's only a handful out there, and some are subjective or. So one of the first studies that come out was that not with supplementation, but just there was a correlation between dietary creatine through what you eat with a reduction in depressive symptoms. So that sort of opened the sort of the doors to say, wow, maybe individuals that don't have depression are eating healthier foods. So keep in mind, seafood, for example, have omega-3s, calcium, vitamin D, many other beneficial effects. So again, that sort of wasn't looking at supplementation, but there's been a few studies that have looked at in combination with individuals taking medication. Creatine has been shown to decrease depressive-like symptoms and anxiety-like symptoms as well. So the theory was maybe clinically diagnosed anxiety and depression, those individuals have compromised brain bioenergetics, usually speculated from the animal model with heightened inflammation. And so going back to some of the mechanisms why creatine can reduce reactive oxidative species and inflammation. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be a large randomized control trial, very expensive, but really needs to be done before we can conclude that creatine has any major benefits to depression. There are some lines of evidence, which is very encouraging, also for PTSD. So I think any abnormality that's affecting brain bioenergetics, I think for the next 20 or 30 years, that's where we're going to be focusing from the neck up, because I think it's so important. I'm on a paper with a good colleague from Norway. We looked at some beneficial effects on creatine on long COVID, and Serge just put out a few others there. And his speculation is maybe the brain with COVID is very sensitive to the beneficial effects of creatine because it's demanding the healing process there as well. So again, these are all things we'll need to consider moving forward.
That was very prescient of you, Darren, because that's where I was going next when thinking about issues that I think will be of interest to many of our listeners. And I think the colleague you're referring to is Serge Ostojic. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. That was some work that came out last year. And one of the things that I found interesting in that study is that the dose was remarkably low. So a lot of the work that's looked at brain creatine has used very high doses. It's used, say, 20 grams a day or so, and often not just during the loading phase. And in that particular study, the dose was 4 grams per day. And obviously it was small scale and it was done for several months, but they did still find a substantial increase in brain creatine. The other thing that you mentioned there that I wanted to just stick a pin in is I wonder how much of the degree to which creatine supplementation increases tissue creatine stores is a function of local demand. Because I've heard you say previously that it might be that skeletal muscle has first dibs when it comes to creatine intake. And when the muscle stores are saturated, it's at that point that creatine will end up boosting brain creatine stores, say. But if we're talking about people receiving 4 grams a day and their brain bioenergetics are compromised, could it be that the relative drop in brain tissue concentration is at least as great as the skeletal muscles? I know that in this study, they also found increased, I think it was VMO creatine concentration too. But is there something to do with local tissue demands when it comes to how creatine intake is shuttled around the body?
Yeah, it's highly plausible. So I'll just backtrack and sort of explain because this is a really important segue. So, of all the studies done, there's two lines of thought. Now, we're just focusing on brain here. So, on average, you can look at one of two ways. Usually, that any beneficial effects on increasing brain creatine and or some measures of cognition. It was about 20 grams a day for at least 7 days. So that's the typical loading phase. But if you say, what about another dosing pattern? Before the Surge study came out last year, it was about 5 grams a day for a minimum of 8 weeks. So now you have two ways to look at it. It's the kind of the loading phase, and sometimes that didn't have an effect. Deshant did the best one where they gave 20 grams a day for a full month to see the effect. And then others have done, 5 grams a day for 8 weeks. Surge's study, he gave 4 grams a day for 6 months. So this is an important distinction. They gave 4 grams a day for 6 months, but they also measured individuals at 3 months. Okay, so it was one of the longer durations, over 12 weeks. And it did improve muscle in the vastus lateralis as well as different areas of the brain. So I was very excited because it was the first study really to show that a low dose can show improvements in two different tissues, brain and muscle. But one thing that never gets talked about a lot, and some people say, geez, why are you taking 10 grams? And there could be a detrimental effect to that, and I'll explain why that is. But it's logical that from a skeletal muscle perspective, that if your muscle stores are already saturated, the transporter to the muscle is going to be downregulated. So someone might say, why don't you cycle it more often than not? If you're continuously taking it, wouldn't you just downregulate your transport in the muscle? And I say, that's probably 100% what's happening. I'm now trying to filter it more to bone and brain. So to your logic, that's probably what's happening. We used to say you store 95% in muscle and trickle amounts in bone and brain. Well, if I'm already happy with my muscle, I'm hoping that that excess amount for a long period of time is now trickling into other areas of the body. So the question is, should you cycle it or not? I can see the logic of why you would cycle it because you don't want to downregulate your transporter in the muscle very often. You want to sensitize it. But if you're going to take it for a long period of time, I see it now trickling into bone and brain, and that's my hope, but it's never been.
I just have an image in my mind of different sinks representing different tissue compartments and those sinks filling up.
Yes.
And there's another image too, which is more the way that I visualize muscle glycogen. When we think about exercise and glycogen supercompensation post-exercise, when somebody has done some sort of strenuous glycogen depleting activity in a particular muscle group, so let's say it's the knee extensors, and they're then refed afterward sufficient amount of carbohydrate, their glycogen stores following the refeeding will be at a higher level than baseline. And in the sink comparison, it could be when one sink is full, the water flows to a different sink, which is what you were discussing there. But if it was more like a glycogen situation, then it could be that when the local energy stores are taxed, the creatine supercompensates in that region specifically. I think you're suggesting that right now, the general school of thought is that it's more likely to be the former, where the water is spilling over some of the sinks and going to other sinks, than the latter, where a local tissue compartment is being depleted, and then that is actively drawing in creatine to that tissue.
Yeah, and I think both are probably correct. And the other big thing regarding muscle is we usually use a relative dose because it makes sense. The larger the muscle is, the more storing capacity you can have for creatine. And for those who have read Roger Harris's paper in 1992, there was one outlier who went way above the 160 millimoles per kilogram of dry muscle. But everybody used to think it was maximized there, but one individual had 183. So it clearly shows that some individuals have a greater storing capacity. So either you can put more in, just like if you get bigger muscle mass, you can have more GLUT4 transporters and more glycogen. But I also agree that if the tissue is really demanding or compromised, it may take in the creatine first. Our body's always trying to maintain homeostasis. And if the brain is really compromised after a concussion, my guess is the brain is going to be more sort of coming in first, if you will, and then muscle will come a distant second. But for those taking creatine every day, That's kind of the theory, is that you're trying to disperse this to different areas of the body more often than not.
Just while it's on my mind, thinking about skeletal muscle, when you look at more superficial muscle fibers within a given muscle, they tend to contain more of the faster isoforms of myosin heavy chains. And so I was thinking that since the creatine storage capacity of type 2 fibers is greater than type 1 fibers, do you think there's any potential that we could have overestimated the degree to which supplementation boosts muscle creatine stores because we're selectively sampling faster fibers?
That's a good analogy. The studies there's only a few that have actually looked at and used biopsies and have looked at the increase in creatine in type 1 and 2. And this is back before we now have the new histochemical staining that a lot of our fibers have a combination. They're hybrid. We don't even have type 2X fibers anymore. Sure. That's changed. So to that idea, there's probably good evidence still that creatine will preferentially be contained more in type 2 fibers, obviously, because those are the ones that use more of the anaerobic metabolisms and primarily more active in myosin. But we see benefits in both. Will that change our explanation now that we're not expressing type 2X fibers with activity? It's probably likely, yeah.
Returning to the brain and thinking about other forms of brain dysfunction that I think are most relevant to listeners, next in line might be concussions. And much of the research on creatine supplementation has been preclinical, but there has also been a very small amount of clinical research. In particular, there was a fascinating study of kids done about 18 years ago now. I wonder if you could just touch on some of the highlights of the work on concussion and how promising you think creatine supplementation is in this.
I wish it was way more promising, and I only say that because of the limited amount of data, and I'll explain why I think there's a limited amount of data. So there was really good animal research in mice and rats showing two schools of thought with creatine. Not only could it help speed up recovery after these rodents got a concussion, but it also preserved or decreased the rate of severity. So it was the only model. Obviously, you can't do this in humans, where you give these animals creatine or placebo, and then you surgically induce a concussion. No ethics board would allow that, obviously, in human research. And then, of course, the only study we have is open label in children. And when these poor children suffered head trauma, they were immediately taken to the hospital and randomized to creatine or placebo. Very high dose, 0.4 grams per kilogram. Again, these are a lot smaller in stature, and they measured a lot of subjective measures for up to 6 months. And when they compared to placebo, these children had a substantial improvement in speech, self-care, efficacy, self-esteem, compared to those who didn't. The detriment is that we did not measure, or sorry, not me, the researchers at the time did not measure any cellular bioenergetics or mechanisms about what's happening. So at the end of the day, we have some minimal evidence to suggest that creatine may speed up the rate of recovery from concussion in animal and or children. What needs to happen is a randomized control trial, but this is where it gets tricky. You now need to randomize healthy individuals before they get a concussion to creatine, and then wait around and wait for an excessive amount of concussions to occur. So imagine the cost and allowing individuals, just say contact sports, rugby, soccer, football, we put them all together and we say, we're just going to wait around and have coffee until you get a concussion. Well, first off, we hope no one ever gets a concussion. And two, the amount of concussions you would need to have some statistical comparison are going to be so high that my guess is this would have to be not only a multi-institution, but a multi-country randomized control trial before we have some of those evidences to speculate there. And that's why if people have asked, this is so important, the NFL and head trauma, it's probably because it's so hard to do.
And I spoke with my friend Tommy Wood on a previous episode about neonatal brain injuries, but I know that Stacey Ellery at Monash is particularly interested in that subject, and she's done some interesting preclinical work on perinatal brain injury, and her work suggests that creatine might be helpful in that context too. Moving on from brain injuries, then we have neurodegenerative diseases, and creatine has been studied in the context of a few of these: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, MS, ALS, and others. My impression looking at that is that the results have been largely quite disappointing. Unfortunately, a lot of those don't respond well to treatments in general. And of them, probably the most promise is in the category of muscular dystrophies. Would you agree with that in general?
I would. So let's start with the positive. There's been a few studies done at McMaster University and then in Europe looking at Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And these young boys who were free to move around when possible, creatine not only improved measures of lean tissue mass, bone mineral density, but functionality. And that's been replicated as well. So there was some beneficial effect there. But unfortunately, when you flip to the other side, there's been no research in humans with Alzheimer's disease. There's one being planned, which is great. And then when we get into the other areas of neurophysiological diseases, the majority of evidence suggests no benefit to Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, and other areas like that as well. The knock against those areas are studies that have been done. They have some minimal benefits, but the majority show no greater effects compared to. And then again, those individuals are having some type of metabolic disease that's sort of going catabolic and could be influencing the effects as well.
One of the issues that's at play is just the ability to boost brain creatine stores. And that brings up the subject of whether there are some better ways to do so. People are interested in various different ways of trying to approach this. Some people are trying to bypass the CT1 transporter. Some people are trying to use other transporters too. Some people are trying to change the expression of the CT1 transporter. But of the different potential compounds that have been studied, the one that I personally found most interesting is guanidinoacetic acid, which I know that Serge, who we mentioned a couple of times, has particular expertise in. And he's done some work showing that very low quantities of this compound, 3 grams a day, better boost creatine stores in the brain and in some skeletal muscles than creatine monohydrate. And the problem with guanidinoacetic acid, of course, is that its safety looks dubious at this point in time, whereas creatine tends to lower homocysteine, for instance. Guanidinoacetic acid tends to increase it, and it's thought that homocysteine is probably bad for cardiovascular health. What do you think about the promise of this particular substance? And do you have any thoughts on how to make creatine or its analogs better able to enter the brain?
I'm always fascinated by new technology and inventions. And obviously, Serge is one of the best creatine researchers, and he's shown quite elegantly with GAA to have some beneficial effects. What hasn't been shown is, does it cause any greater effects than creatine on a muscle or brain effect? But I'm definitely open to all research. I don't have a great understanding on the analog. Creatine transporters are very specific, but that analog seems to be able to get in. People are saying, what about high dose carbohydrates? Well, there's going to be connotations with that as well. But I'm curious, can creatine and GAA be better than creatine alone from a total body perspective? More clinical studies and the safety profile. That's why creatine monohydrate, I know it's kind of boring because it's been around for a while, but it has an amazing safety profile and it is effective for a lot of things. And that's why it seems to be true, tried and tested. But these new inventions and patents and technology, I'm very curious and excited to see where the future is going for sure.
So do you think the combination of creatine with GAA might be promising? Thinking about homocysteine specifically, if creatine is reducing it and GAA is increasing it, then maybe creatine might help offset some of its effects. And by bypassing the CT1 transporter and using some other creatine transporters, the addition of GAA might better boost stores in tissue such as the brain.
Yeah, it's plausible. And could the GAA help suck up creatine through the blunted number of doorways or transporters that's specific for creatine in the brain? So that would be a very, very interesting and important study for sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then obviously homocysteine brings up cardiovascular health. And there are some reasons to think that creatine might be good for the cardiovascular system in general. The heart, of course, is very energy hungry. And there's a little bit of work suggesting that creatine might help reduce some lipids that most people think are atherogenic, such as VLDL and triglycerides. And then obviously we have homocysteine. Do you think creatine's effects on these various different markers of cardiovascular health are actually meaningful, though? Do you think that this might have any clinical relevance?
Yeah, there's been a few There's been a few studies and review articles that have looked at the promise, and it is emerging. Obviously, cardiac tissue, very similar. The skeletal muscle uses creatine for a lot of its contractions, and obviously for damaged heart tissue, creatine could help have some decrease in oxidative stress. But it has some potential promise for a lot of the cardiovascular related diseases. And I think there is some promise there as well. Some people have asked about hypertension and, creatine, as long as those individuals don't have detrimental effects to the kidney already, creatine should not have any adverse effects from an acute or hypertensive responsiveness. But obviously individuals need to talk to their doctor. But I do see a lot of promise there. Special issue of creatine last year, a really good article came out on the potential vascular benefits of creatine. And there's been a few good ones there, laying the foundation for its potential later on for sure.
The reproductive system is very energy hungry too. And I know that some people have put forward sperm creatine concentrations and creatine kinase activity as proxies of sperm quality. Regarding women, creatine demands are surely very high during conception and pregnancy, and probably during lactation as well. So do you think that creatine supplementation is likely a helpful inclusion at this point in life?
Yeah, so I always would defer this to Stacey Ellery, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, but it seems like, using the animal model, or at least the theory, it can have some potential benefits for either pregnancy or developing fetus, or decreasing the chance of inborn deficiencies. But the area is so in its infancy that it'll probably need, multiple years of research to truly say, is it safe and potentially advantageous? And then the question is it advantageous for every female? And do they even need it? Those are the questions. But again, severe caution needs to be there. Stacey would say the exact same thing, that we're sort of not even scratching the tip of the iceberg, let alone getting halfway down on that area as well.
And I think she uses sheep as a model organism. Is that right? That's a really interesting choice, because I guess they've got such a long gestation period.
That's correct. She does, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I've always thought that of all the different populations out there, new parents are among the people that are most likely to benefit from creatine, in large part because they are so sleep disrupted. And if it can help during that energy demanding time of life, then it seems like a relatively easy win. But you mentioned safety there. And I don't want to dwell on this, but I thought it would be worth briefly discussing safety, because some people still have concerns about things like the health of their kidneys, and obviously the most important subject, namely whether creatine drives hair loss in men.
That's right. Yeah, so I think one of the biggest questions, because a lot of people think it's too good to be true, and at a recommended dosage, we're not seeing any detrimental effects on liver, cardiovascular, or renal function. It's not a steroid, and of course, when people see me, they're like, "Oh, I see. Obviously, creatine causes hair loss." And I've sort of changed my answer to this, because the study that's archaic now, but it's only been one small scale study in rugby players, clearly showed that creatine increased DHT, but it's serum DHT, which is not correlated to hair thinning, follicle loss, and the increase in that simple hormone was well within the normal reference range. But when people say, does creatine cause hair loss, the only way to answer this scientifically is say, we have no idea. There's never been a single study that have measured hair follicle cross-sectional area or quantity. So at the end of the day, all we can say is there's no evidence to suggest that it does, but there's no evidence to suggest really that it doesn't. The only way I can sort of answer it subjectively is I've assessed well over 1,000 people, and half of those individuals were on creatine, and not a single person has ever come to me saying that their hair was thinning. And I would speculate if that was happening, they would let me know that.
I suppose at this point in time, it's still plausible that creatine could support hair growth, because presumably those follicular cells are quite energy demanding.
Yeah, the vast majority of people I know have a full head of hair and they take creatine. So obviously, correlation is not causation. So there you go. Yep.
And then regarding kidney health, I think people were concerned about this because creatine intake will boost creatinine. And if somebody goes to their doctor and gets a blood test, and that's included as part of a standard panel, then the doctor might be scratching his or her head. But that in isolation is no cause for concern. Various factors will push up creatinine, one of which is having more muscle mass, one of which is being physically active in general. And
Right.
so if you add creatine use on top of that, then creatinine is going to be higher. And I think it's worth pointing out that there are some better proxies of kidney health for hard charging people taking creatine, and markers such as cystatin C might be relatively more helpful for those people. Moving on to forms of creatine, monohydrate is, of course, very bioavailable. And I think the most important thing to point out is that it's worth getting third-party tested products if that's a concern to you. And monohydrate's not very stable in solution, is it? And also, I think if you heat it up, so if you add lots of hot water to it, then that's also going to increase its breakdown into creatinine. So if you're going to mix it with something, then presumably it'd be better to mix it with something that's cooler and to not let it sit for too long. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, even when you mix it in solution, it's relatively stable if the solution is not very, very hot, like boiling temperature. And the longer it goes, it'll degrade the creatinine. But if it's never gotten wet, the powder form is obviously what we're considering or talking about when you mix it in solution. So yeah, creatine can get degraded to creatinine, definitely in acidic solutions. That's why you'll never find it in an acidic beverage. But if you're mixing it in water and you say, I don't have time to drink it now, you can put it in the fridge and it'll remain intact for a few days. So that's nothing to worry about. And it's something I think for the average person, you never need to really worry about. Most people that I know that take creatine will take it in their preference of when they want to ingest it.
Yeah, I only mentioned solution because I remember during my undergrad, there were some products on the market which were basically creatine drinks that were ready to drink. And they were surely just creatinine drinks as opposed to creatine. You've touched on the fact that the ideal dose might differ depending on the tissues in question, and potentially also some other variables too, such as somebody's age. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about doses for different tissues if people are looking for some of these benefits, and also within that, touch on your thoughts about whether a loading dose is necessary.
So it's a really hard thing to differentiate because you don't want to make it too complicated, but for the individual. But on average, the dose that seems to be effective from a skeletal muscle perspective, you can do the loading phase, as we alluded to, 20 grams a day for about 5 to 7 days, and then reduce that as low as 2 grams a day. Been shown to be extremely effective from a muscle perspective. If you don't want to do the loading phase, you can just start as little as 3 grams a day, and it'll take about a month to sort of get to the same rate. But again, those individuals are probably taking it for a long period of time. Regarding bone, the lowest dose we seem to be effective with exercise is about 8 grams. And now we're sort of have a diversion with the brain. We have either a low dose, 4 to 5 grams for a minimum of 8 weeks, or 20 grams a day for longer. So when you do the math, on average, it's about 10 grams if you're looking at a whole body perspective. Do you need to take that in one bolus? No, you can divide that up into multiple smaller dosages. 3 grams for breakfast, 3 grams with lunch, 3 grams for supper. It doesn't matter when you take creatine because it simply needs to accumulate. Can you take it in one bolus? Is that different than multiple frequencies? We're actually doing that study upcoming in our lab to see, does multiple dosages at a smaller amount cause any greater effects than a bolus? We just don't know that. But there's probably no reason to suggest it does, but it's going to be interesting to find out. So at the end of it, if someone says, I'm really concerned about muscle, I think you can do 3 grams a day or 20 grams a day and lower it down to 2. If you say, hey, I'm interested in muscle and bone, maybe increase it by a few grams, maybe 7 or 8 grams a day. It's not going to have any detrimental or negative effects. And then, of course, if you say, hey, I'm an athlete, I'm always sleep deprived, I'm also a university student, I don't know if 20 grams a day every day is viable, but maybe 10 grams a day is a little bit more, and that could hopefully give you a whole body perspective.
And given creatine's osmotic effects, do you think that taking a 20-gram bolus is likely to cause people some issues? So would you recommend that if somebody is taking over 10 grams per day, they split that dose in 2, for instance, just to try and avoid any potential digestive issues?
Yeah, all the side effects we usually get the loading phase are during the 20 grams a day. And again, they're taken in multiple 4 by 5 gram dosages. So it may be the total amount. So with myself, I take about 5 grams in the morning and I drink about 5 grams of creatine during my workout. I just like to divide it up. But I might change that based on our study. Maybe take it all at once is better. But Roger Harris in the early 2000s did a really elegant study where he looked at multiple small dosages, and the muscles seem to retain more and having less being converted to creatinine. And it helps maintain the plasma sort of concentration throughout the day. So that's why these multiple small dosages, if you can remember it and if it's convenient, is great. But if you say, God, I'll never remember to take multiple dosages, I can only do it in the morning, I'm sure you'll get probably the similar effects.
And would you recommend the same relative doses for kids, or would you err on the side of caution and say that people shouldn't take it until they are a certain age?
Yeah, the existing body of literature suggests that creatine is safe in children and adolescents, and some of the recommendations are kind of no different than adults. If it's an absolute dose, maybe less, 3 to 5 grams, or if it's relative, you can do maybe 0.1 gram. Again, they're a lot smaller in size. At the end of the day, 3 to 5 grams. I would be very surprised if it wasn't effective, and at that dose, I think it would be very safe. But until blood biomarkers come out looking at liver and kidney enzyme in children, there's a caution, just like pregnancy is warranted as well.
Okay, so your guidance for pregnant women would be the same, would it?
Yeah, or there's good papers that'll suggest a little bit lower, and it equates to about 3 to 5 grams. I don't think anybody would argue that 3 grams is a very safe, viable dose to consider starting with. Again, that's a serving and a half of seafood or red meat is very similar. Yeah.
And then regarding cycling, no particular need to cycle it. Muscle and brain stores seem to remain elevated for probably upwards of 4 weeks post supplementation. But if it's perfectly safe, and there have been studies where people have been given 30 grams a day for several years without any ill effects, then there's no particular reason to come off it.
Yeah. I agree. There's logic there to cycle it, but no studies ever compared continuous versus cycling. And again, if it's safe and it stays in the muscle for about 4 weeks, the brain is a little bit longer. Even if you do decide to travel and not take it, you're indirectly cycling it naturally. So you can get it through your diet or maintain activities of daily life.
And then thinking about creatine in the context of diet more broadly, carbohydrate and protein being quite insulinotropic seem to increase muscle creatine uptake. Do you think that might influence the amount of creatine that's going to the brain?
So that's an excellent question. It's definitely been shown to have an augmentation in muscle. It can potentially, in theory, it may not be any different in the brain tissue as well. But again, that's only speculation. But it definitely has been shown to have the insulinogenic effect. Does that have the same principle on getting across the blood-brain barrier? I'm not sure.
And then you mentioned caffeine earlier. Creatine and caffeine differentially affect calcium handling within skeletal muscle. And there's some evidence, including some work by yourself, suggesting that combining them might actually hamper training adaptations. So I wonder if you could share your thoughts on consuming creatine in close proximity to caffeine, because I think a lot of people do that. A lot of people will take creatine and they'll add it to their morning tea or their morning coffee.
Yeah, so this is an area of huge debate. So there's a few studies that give logic of why you may not want to combine them. And it's based on a few things. So if you're going to take creatine for a little bit longer than maybe 3 days, there is some cellular data to suggest that caffeine ingestion over 200 milligrams may blunt the effects. And it has to do with the relaxation time at the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Creatine likes to cause calcium to be taken back into sarcoplasmic reticulum, and caffeine likes to release it. So they sort of play tug of war. And then there's some other evidence that when you combine the two at higher dosages, it can cause GI tracts. So that might not be palatable for athletes or exercising individuals. Now, the dose of caffeine probably dictates the interference effect. So my thought is, if you have a normal black coffee at 80 milligrams of caffeine and you put your creatine in there and drink it, will that negate the effects? We don't know, but the dose seems to be an important thing to consider. So higher dose caffeine may interfere with the ergogenic properties of creatine. It doesn't interfere with the pharmacokinetics, but there is some evidence and a few studies now saying that if you combine the two, they totally negate each other. So I tell people, from a practical standpoint, since you only want to take caffeine before you work out, why not take your coffee or caffeine pre-exercise And since the timing of creatine is irrelevant, you can take creatine at any other time, just if there is a big interference effect. What hasn't been done is a long-term training study. We've done a really, really small-scale study which showed a potential blunting effect, but you need an adequately sample size individual or a study to show doesn't really interfere. And does the dose of caffeine play a role? My guess is it probably does.
Muscle activity per se does seem to shuttle creatine into muscles. And so that's one more reason why it might make sense to take it post-exercise. I also wonder about the effects of combining caffeine and creatine on the brain, because they're affecting homeostatic sleep drive through different mechanisms. Caffeine is an antagonist to all of the adenosine receptors, so it's blocking the interaction of that sleep hunger signal with its receptors, whereas creatine is reducing the accumulation of the adenosine. And so whereas they seem to have antagonistic effects in skeletal muscle, I wonder if they might have agonistic effects or additive effects in the brain. That's a study that's probably worth doing at some point. I agree that it makes a lot of sense to have caffeine early in the day and then save creatine for later in the day. I'd love to end with a brief chat about the future of creatine research and what you're particularly interested in and excited about, both in the short term and in years to come. So I wonder if you could share a bit about the projects you're currently involved in, and also what you would like to do in the future if you had the means to do so.
Yeah, so we have about 7 studies upcoming that we're excited about. So the question regarding creatine timing will sort of be put to rest here. We have a few studies in younger individuals to really determine, is it blood flow or creatine transport kinetics that if it is upregulated with the timing of creatine ingestion in close proximity to resistance training, is that important? And then we're moving on to another study looking at, can creatine rescue the effects of mental fatigue? So in other words, when you give an individual a mentally fatiguing task, can creatine sort of rescue the effects? And then we're moving on to the older adult. We're going to be looking at home exercise in combination with creatine. And can this be a sort of a lifestyle intervention to improve or be an anti-sarcopenic effect? Down the road, I would really like to look at the effects of creatine in young females, primarily from a bone accretion standpoint. And I'd also like to look at the effects of creatine from in individuals with cancer and osteoporosis and diagnosed sarcopenia. So those are the areas we're sort of looking at down the road. I collaborate with a lot of labs around the world in different areas, looking at dementia and, of course, from the neck up. So it's a huge area of interest. We're really excited, and we're really excited to get some new data out, hopefully by the end of the year. Yeah.
Fantastic. On the subject of strenuous cognitive activity, what kind of tasks are you talking about there? Are you talking about some sort of exceptionally long, tedious Stroop test or something?
Yeah, it is the Stroop test. Yeah, it is the Stroop test, and we're going to be measuring. And the theory there is we want to induce mental fatigue, and then can the individual perform cognitive tasks later? And that has huge applications for university students or students studying for exams. They're cramming, they're mentally fatigued. Does that correlate to potentially improve better on the test? That would have huge applications for academia.
Are you familiar with Samuel Marcora's work on brain endurance training?
No, I'm not.
So he's done some work combining exhaustive exercise with cognitive training as a way of basically showing that there's overlap between the two, and that if you do a cognitively demanding task before endurance exercise, then that actually hampers performance in the physical exercise. But the converse is probably also true as well.
Oh, yeah.
And so I wonder if you're looking to tax the brain, then combining exercise with the cognitively demanding task might be a way of enforcing a double whammy of sorts.
Yeah, we actually thought of that, and it was just too elaborate for the scope of the design.
And then regarding aging, do you have any thoughts on creatine and its relevance to the so-called hallmarks of aging? This is a hot topic in the world of longevity research, and I know that people are interested in various different amino acids. There's been some work on glycine, and there was a paper published on taurine last year, which I think was in the journal Science, suggesting that it positively affected various hallmarks of aging. You've spoken a bit about creatine and its effects on inflammation. Do you think that creatine might be a good candidate longevity supplement?
Yeah, it's probably our biggest focal point in our lab on creatine. So what we put it into healthy aging, and it doesn't really have any effect on the telomere length or the functionality, but it can have some cellular benefits. So I think in combination with exercise, creatine could be an adjunct to a healthy lifestyle to have some potential beneficial effects. It may improve cellular health, but then of course you'd have to quantify what measures of cellular health you're doing. But if it does decrease inflammation, that's a hallmark of sarcopenia, so it does have some anti-sarcopenic effects.
On the subject that I was just curious about your thoughts on is how to look at where creatine goes. Can you, for example, radio label creatine to look at the tissues that it ends up in, and thereafter look at ways of helping shuttle it to different tissues?
Yeah, there's been an intravenous study. There's only been 2, I think, with label creatine to just look at the mechanisms of blood flow. But again, no labs usually do that just based on the price. They'll do amino acid tracers.
Fascinating. Well, Darren, thank you so much for your time today. You've been so generous and you are a true expert. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you. You are a leading light in this latest wave of creatine research. And I also appreciate your humility because I've listened to some podcasts with you previously and you're always tipping your hat to some of the people that have come before you, the likes of Eric Holtman and Paul Greenhalgh and all of these other scientists. And I'm sure that people will be doing the same to you in the future. So keep up the great work.
Great. Thanks for having me.